This is a conversation with Armando Diaz. He's the founder of the Magnet Theatre and one of the best improv teachers in history. He's a bona fide legend in the improv community who has an entire improv format named after him. In this conversation, we discuss the power of improv, the benefits it can have in your daily life. We talk about the role of comedy in the world, the impact of SNL, and he also shares some tips for improvisation and the challenges of running a theater. This is no time. If you like what you see, then do hit subscribe on YouTube, follow on Spotify, or rate 5 stars in Apple Podcasts. This project takes a lot of my time, money, and effort, as much as a second job. So if you'd like to see it continue, do consider making a donation on Patreon, Anchor. You can join as a member on YouTube. You can buy super thanks on YouTube, or you can leave gifts on Instagram Reels. If not through monetary channels, and do consider sharing these episodes, leaving your likes and comments, all forms of engagement. They really go a long way. For other forms of love and support, you can follow this channel on Instagram or Twitter, or follow me personally. And now, it's no time. Del Close had once said that the world is a slightly better place for having improvisation in it than it was before. There's something about it that says something positive about the human spirit, that a bunch of people can get together and by following a few simple traffic rules can create art and can entertain an audience and can thrill and exalt each other.
Mm-hmm.
I want to start by asking you about the power of improv, the magic of improv. What does improv mean to you? Why is it important? And do you agree with Del that it shows us something positive about the human spirit, that the world is a better place with improv in it?
Yeah, I agree with him. He's dead. Got to give him respect. I mean, I think just life and evolution's improv. So, I think it's part of the life force. But I do think what's great about improv is you tap into pure creativity, which is amazing. That other art forms, I think share, like improv obviously shares the same kind of thing, but you become very much aware when you're sort of tapped into the flow, when you're really like, your antennas up and you're receiving and you're getting, you're in contact with the muse. And so, for people to have that experience, just that alone is pretty amazing. That whole thing of like you're in the spot and you hit a moment of inspiration and then there's success and there's laughter and, just on an artistic level, it's really cool. But, on just a human level, the idea of like intimacy and community, like, having a connection with another person, that to be in a scene together and to really work together and build together, you need to be present. You need to listen. So it's a wonderful thing. It feels great. It's very life affirming. It's very transformative. It changed my life. I see it change my students' lives all the time. For me, when it first happened, I was just like, wow, this is amazing. This is something that's really valuable. And I see how it affects students, especially people who are non-performers that where in their lives do they get a chance to, have permission to be open and to let their guard down and to share with themselves, but also appreciate other people, And so I think that's something that society's really missing these days. And I think, not to say that improv could solve all the ills of the world, but I think the idea of treating each other like human beings and, attempting to have community and connection is really the only way we're going to solve these problems.
There's so many, just like a great improviser, you've given me so many different prompts that I want to go and explore, and I will do that. But before we do that, I just want to pull back a bit and ask you a potentially silly question.
Mm-hmm.
For those who don't know, and for those who might have the wrong idea, what is improv? Can you define it?
Okay. Yeah. So for our purposes, like we do improv scene work. And so basically you're following a set of rules which allow for people to get up on stage and improvise a scene together. And They're very simple rules. There's this idea of yes and, which players are trained to follow, in which anytime somebody offers up an idea, everybody's job is to accept that idea and try and further it, try and see what the strength or the value is in it, that we're trying to really tease out the potential of that idea. And so because people are doing that, more often than not, the ideas realize themselves, and that's what allows for you to kind of create things on the spot, is to just kind of be open and treat each other like we're all geniuses, and that there's something to this, and so, we do it for comedy and we do it for like stage and theater. But it is something that's just like valuable in all walks of life, whether it's just like you're using it in your sort of business world and, ideation or things like that. You're trying to brainstorm an idea or you're trying to engineer a solution. You have to kind of be open to, wild ideas, different ideas, things like that. So improv is just basically, we're teaching people how to do scene work and kind of find comedy and express themselves.
You mentioned the benefits, the transferable skills. I want to linger on that and expand that even further. What are the benefits of improv, not just for people who are performers, who are into show business, but like, are there any transferable skills that you can apply in your daily life or at a normal desk job? You mentioned some of them, but I want to expand them even further.
Yeah, let's not talk about that. You know what? My idea. No, people in work, sometimes, people often have the experience of getting shut down. Like I was kind of joking around with you just now. And so you notice that sort of the same 2 or 3 people are talking during meetings and contributing ideas, and there creates this apprehension, this fear of that, you're not welcome, and so you kind of lose the whole benefit of everybody's skill set if you don't use that. But, the thing on just personal relationships, having a decent conversation, I remember before, like, I was a really closed off kind of sheltered guy, and so just the idea of like, being open to other people and saying yes, it just kind of opened up more possibilities to to meet people, be friends, and to kind of be interested in all kinds of people, and so nothing kills a conversation than when somebody's just either talking at you or, not listening. And so one of the common things, like I was hanging out with some improvisers and they're trading stories about like doing online dating or whatever. And there's kind of common occurrence where all these improvisers talk about how they would go on a date, and then at the end of the date, the person would be like, oh my goodness, this was so great. Like, I feel so open to you, and like, gosh, let's go out again. It's like, no, not really. It's like, what? I thought we really had a connection. It's like, no, I'm just an improviser. I know how to talk to somebody, like in a way, like we think we're normal because we're just like, hey, we're not putting our baggage out here, having any hangups. We're just like, okay, what do? You make aircrafts. Great. Tell me about that. Love it. And so on a social level, it really helps a lot.
I definitely see so many benefits of improv, not just in dating, but also at work. Like you mentioned, it can make your conversation so much richer, your relationship so much richer. Definitely fantastic. Let me introduce another topic. Let's also talk about the power of comedy, which is not required to, but often walks hand in hand with improv. Fyodor Dostoevsky had once said that if you wish to glimpse inside a human soul and get to know a man, don't bother analyzing his ways of being silent, of talking, of weeping, of seeing how much he is moved by noble ideas. You will get better results if you just watch him laugh. If he laughs well, he's a good man. Let's talk about the power of comedy as well. What power does it have? What role does comedy play in society? Why is it important? And like Dostoevsky, would you agree that laughter and comedy is the most reliable gauge of human nature?
Okay. Yeah. So a number of things, like I'm somebody who always like enjoys documentaries, and so my head's kind of filled with like all kinds of fragments of things. I'm not like a greatly educated person, but I just got like little bits and pieces. So, but I was listening to it was either a documentary or it was like something on NPR or whatever. They're talking about the origin of laughter, and there was some belief that was kind of an important thing in terms of like early human relationships to keep peace, that the laughter was kind of a signal or a cue that you're not trying to have conflict, and especially probably early on with limited language, that just that idea of like, how do you know if this other Homo sapien is like ready to like go to battle, or you're just like, like, and you just kind of know. And so it's kind of like a very simple, thing, I think, to just sort of keep the peace or whatnot. But, comedy, and this kind of goes into Del Close thing. I remember reading an article about Del, he was talking, he had some class back in San Francisco, like in the 60s or whatever. And he had heard this story about this, this Inuit man who he fell into the frozen river and almost died. And so they had this tradition of that you would make songs up, and that was kind of a way to exercise his fear. And that Del was just kind of talking about, like, that's what art does. Art's there to help us like understand things and exercise our demons and like make sense of life, and comedy is a part of that, that comedy is this way to, I think, kind of more on our level, it's just a way to kind of make things okay, like that. So often in a class, people will tell stories, they'll trade true stories, and like lots of times they're like embarrassing situations that in the moment, it's like when you were in high school, you would have been horrified. But then now when you're telling it and somebody else has told their high school story, you laugh at it and suddenly it's like, oh, you let go, it's gone. It's like that. This is funny. This isn't this thing that's now an open wound that you're carrying all your life. And so comedy, art has a way for us to, sort of release those things, or to like be able to, cope with them. And then it's been interesting lately because like comedy started off as being kind of very low profession. It just started in strip clubs and, vaudeville or whatever. And it was just, like Richard Pryor talks about starting off doing comedy in a strip club, where it's just like, the whole reason why they got a comedian there is just kind of sort of stall so that they can keep people there till the next dancer or whatever. So you got to really, be good to make these horny guys laugh or whatever. But nowadays, like if you look at the New York Times or, other papers, they'll actually quote late night talk shows. They'll like bring up a joke that they made, and it's like, oh, how did this get in the Times? Or you look at the election where Sarah Palin was the vice presidential nominee or whatever, and Tina Fey doing her impression of her just, I feel like, had a political ramification. I feel like it was one of those things where it was comedy, but it kind of quickly pointed out that like, hey, this VP pick is just outrageous. This person's not qualified, and it's like, how can we take this ticket seriously? And, and then there are times where it's like comedy is kind of a way to punch up and, kind of give a poke in the eye to like an authoritarian regime, where it's like, oh, you can get away with like a joke, or, suddenly that invincibility, that whole like, dear leader, like just supporting them, like, they get humiliated. And then so it gives courage to other people to start to assert themselves and, fight on their own. So, I think comedy has a range of purposes, I guess.
Tina Fey did play Sarah Palin, and she got a Mark Twain Award for that performance as well, and the impact of it. Let's talk about the purpose of comedy. You've often said that when you were in high school, or when you were in film school as well, comedy wasn't taken seriously as much. You just mentioned as well, the origins of it were from vaudeville, and it used to be this intermittent act at strip clubs. A lot of film schools didn't even have like a serious comedy course as well at that point. If you fast forward today, like you mentioned, comedy is now this powerful tool for commentary on social and political issues. You have comedians like John Oliver, Stephen Colbert, Dave Chappelle, Ricky Gervais, Jon Stewart, who use comedy as a tool for sending a message. Let's talk about the purpose of comedy, because George Carlin had once said that it is the duty of every comedian to find out where the line is drawn and then cross it deliberately. I just listed these comedians who frequently cross that line. But then you have comedians like Conan O'Brien or John Mulaney, Jim Gaffigan, maybe Martin Short, Steve Martin, who used to resort more to like sketch comedy or maybe goofy or like self-deprecating humor, impressions, and not something that would necessarily be controversial. So how important is it for comedy to send a message? How important is it for the comedian to use their platform to make commentary on social and political issues? Or is that putting too much burden on the comedian?
Well, I mean, it's a personal choice, you know what I mean? That like, just as if you are a musician and you decide to start a band or whatever, you got to play the music that you want to play. And so like, if you're somebody who likes silly stuff, you know, you're just going to come off as false trying to do political stuff, because if that's not your nature, you know what I mean? So all comedy doesn't need to be satire. You know, there are people that are really great at like, Colbert is fantastic at it, you know. And Conan, while a super educated guy, super well-read, always knows a ton, but it's just not his nature to do satire, you know, not that I don't think he appreciates it, but like he understands like this is my kind of humor or whatever. I think it's important to have it out there. And I think unfortunately in these times, you know, in the last 20 years, it's been kind of the main source for, our generation and subsequent generations to get the news. That's their source of news, as opposed to reading the newspaper or watching it on TV or whatnot. So it's helped. And so somebody like Jon Stewart has been invaluable in terms of like being sort of a counterpoint to just corporate media, and has really, I think, opened up not only like many comedians and different shows that do satire, but other sort of independent news sources. People have started their own podcasts and own investigations and things like that. So, you know, comedy's kind of the way that you can grease the wheels with it, because it's kind of like, oh, well, Jon Stewart, you can't take him seriously. You know, it's just, you know, a daily show, just like some silly show on Comedy Central. But then suddenly the information starts coming out, you know? So I do think that if you are going to do something like satire or, you know, any type of commentary criticism, it is about truth, and it is about having a perspective and a point of view, you know? And so that's kind of one of the things that can escape people attempting to do satire, is that they don't have standing in terms of like, well, what is it that I morally believe, you know, that's at the center of what I'm trying to say, you know? And so when you do a strong piece of satire, that comes through very clearly, you know, that like, okay, yeah, you're pointing out a hypocrisy or an injustice, but it emanates out of a moral center. So in a way, I feel like comedy's been kind of keeping up the social contract, where it's like, you know, journalism, especially like big journalism, has kind of dropped the ball or just been carrying water for moneyed interests.
I agree. I feel like every time comedians get a bit more towards the end of keeping up the social contract of getting a bit too real or sending a message or or really exploring the truth in comedy, I've seen a lot of comedians backtrack by saying, oh, I'm just telling jokes. This is just a joke. Don't treat me seriously. I'm a fool. I'm a comedian. Don't take any of this seriously. In fact, I've also watched a few comedians, I don't know, and might have been Jon Stewart, might have been John Oliver, but they come on other interviews and they say that, oh, I'm just telling jokes. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a firefighter. I'm not saving lives. But we just spoke about the power that comedy has. You just spoke about the social contract of telling the truth. You also mentioned earlier about how transformative it was, how it was life-changing for you. How important a role do comedians play in society? Can you make the case that their role is as noble as that of a doctor or a firefighter, that spreading joy and laughter in someone's life is as good as saving one?
I would say probably people on the upper end of that, not to diminish what doctors and scientists and teachers do, you know what I mean? So I would say it's a very rare few people that you could say, have that same kind of nobility. But yeah, there's a whole continuum in terms of like what people's beliefs are when it comes to free speech and communication. And so there are people in the comedy world that have a very pure, idea of just like that. You should be able to say anything, and it comes out of sort of the realization that it's like, yeah, we shouldn't be afraid of ideas, because not talking about ideas is where we, become the victims of things, that it's like, sex was never a topic that could be talked about, that on TV shows, they couldn't even say the word pregnant on a sitcom, way back, just even in the 70s or 60s, not talking about sex doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and especially with anybody who has sort of a different experience with sex than the mainstream, or what the mainstream message is, or anybody struggling with something, the ability to talk to other people who have similar situations, especially like LGBTQ plus community, that is that ability to commune and talk about things and compare notes and kind of help people out, and so comedy can do that, that whole thing with Carlin, like crossing the line, it was because there were comedians that sort of pushed the boundaries a bit. Now, on the other hand, I think there has to be a sensitivity and a recognition about people who are hurting, you know what I mean? And so your best friend just lost their parent. You wouldn't like go up to him and be like, your mom's dead. Ha, ha, ha. Even though it's just like, well, death is a regular part of life. We should be able to talk about like this person's hurting, and so that isn't, if I had a friend that was going through that, I wouldn't feel victimized about my free speech about that, I'm not being oppressed because I'm respecting my friend who is hurting and is in need and needs some consideration. And so, but the problem is that the internet is driven by polarization. That polarized views is what gets clicks. You can't be reasonable and get big ratings or a big following. You have to stand out somehow. And so the internet has been putting us at each other's throats because of a profit motivation, and it's just a silly, insidious thing. Like it seems so innocuous, so simple. So, I got a website and I'm just going to put this comment up and get some likes. And in a way we get like sort of trained like Pavlovian dogs to like, we need to get those likes, everybody falls for it. Like, I feel bad when I post something up that I think is funny and then nobody likes it or shares it, and so in a way, that happens to us. And so as much as you could be like a Lenny Bruce fan and feel like, yeah, talk about anything, you have to kind of live in the community and you have to kind of be aware of who you're talking to. And nowadays that extends beyond the room that you're playing. So if I'm doing a show and it's me and the audience, that's sort of like our relationship. But now that there's the ability to like have that broadcast throughout the world, somebody tapes it on a phone or, you decide to put it up as a video. It's like, now it's like you're talking to the whole world. So it makes it a bit more complicated. And so for me, while I think it's important to not be afraid of ideas, I also think that you have to be a human being and don't be such a selfish jerk that you're just like, I'm just doing it for me, because I think that's like a bunch of bull.
Let's continue talking about the impact of comedy. You brought up Tina Fey and her portrayal of Sarah Palin and the impact that that had. Let's talk about one of the shows that has such a huge impact when you were growing up as well. Let's talk about Saturday Night Live. You've often said in previous interviews that every Monday, people were always talking about the show and they were trying to reenact these sketches, try to do the impressions again. For a lot of people in my generation, SNL is just another show now, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So for those of us who weren't there, can you talk about the aura of that show? How important was Saturday Night Live? And when you look back now, is it fair to say that it was one of the turning points in the history of comedy?
Oh yeah, definitely. You know what I mean? Because it was targeted towards sort of younger people. It was like hip, so like the history of TV, when it came to shows, like so many of the shows that they'd have on would be kind of like for the whole family, you know what I mean? So, so it'd be like, it wasn't specialized. And so, if you're young and you're kind of watching your parents' comedy, you'd be like, oh, okay, that's all right. But it's not speaking to you, But since it was like, I was on later at night, and it was kind of a hip, edgy show. And it was kind of like, it was like our show, and there's nothing out there like that, because otherwise, you kind of had like a billion variety shows in the 70s, like just everybody had a variety show from like Dean Martin to, Laugh-In to, Sonny and Cher to whoever, and so then they'd have kind of like their comedy pieces and then have a comedy song, and, and they'd like have a, kind of, it was very vaudeville-like, like they'd have some kind of guest star and it's like, oh, Charlton Heston, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, so it was a little like, it was at the point where suddenly we'd gone too far and indulged an idea. Mm-hmm. And so the comedy that came afterwards made a lot of fun of those kinds of shows in that generation. Like every kind of lounge singer or, like there was just kind of this idea of like, showbiz, where it's going to be, guys in these suits with like pinky rings and, and like their hair combed down like a helmet and, and smoking on stage. And, like they're all kind of wannabe Rat Pack people, and so it became ridiculous. So if you look at like Conan, in the early days, like so many of like, there was a lot of that comedy of making fun of stuff from the 70s because it was just ridiculous,
Yeah.
So something like SNL was great because it talked about things that were, not talked about, so, they talked about smoking pot or, talked about sex or they talked about, or they made fun of politicians, not in the kind of way where it's just like, oh, well, I'm just going to give Nixon a little ribbing, as opposed to like, no, this is a murderous psycho, who's destroying the world, like, so that was kind of like, but as kids, like, we didn't think that deeply of it. It was just something that was just like, you could get and you identified with.
Let me try to ask you a follow-up to this. So while SNL was at its peak, you had enrolled in film school at Columbia College in Chicago. And you've often mentioned that film school ruined films for me because the pretentious nature of filmmaking was extremely unappealing. Is there a danger of that happening in comedy and improv and theater as well? Because as a teacher, what you're doing is you're pulling back the curtain and you're showing people the behind the scenes. You're showing them the secrets of that magic trick. You're trying to dissect it like a science to a certain extent. When you do that, is there a danger of ruining comedy for yourself, improv for yourself?
Well, when it becomes formulaic, and this is kind of one of the reasons why I kind of teach the way I teach and I do what I do. And oftentimes, like I'll have classes where people might have studied, at other places. And so one of the things I end up fighting against is like overly structured improv, that they're like, okay, it's a 3-beat scene and that you got to identify who the straight person in the scene is. And this is the crazy, and it's like, yeah, but that's a narrow train's coming.
Yeah.
I got to go. I mean, that's just, it's kind of the same thing when they would do that with music, like where pop music is just like so manufactured, and like, auto tune and things like that. Like that, it's like, you can teach things that are going to be sort of very typical. Like, things that are going to pay off. Like high percentage of paying off, as opposed to originality. And so to me, one of the best things about teaching is like meeting people, and especially when you get like really original people and sort of people that you wouldn't expect would have an interest in performing or comedy. And you're like, oh my goodness, this person, this 90-year-old woman is hilarious and really adventurous. And, and like in another school or class, she would be totally unwelcome, and that to me is a shame, and so you can know a lot, but, the key to is just like, get rid of it. Like, let's just keep it organic and, not be afraid of just kind of having pure organic moments.
That has been one of like the core principles at the Magnet, and I definitely felt it as well. That it was open to everybody and everyone was welcome and all different styles were embraced. So I really, really like that. Is it hard for you to just sit back and relax and just enjoy a scene or enjoy comedy because you know so much about it now? You teach it as well. Is it hard for you to switch off that part of your brain that's trying to dissect every beat and say, oh, this is how they initiated the scene. These are the gifts they gave. These are the prompts. Is it tough for you?
When it's contrived, yeah, I have a hard time enjoying it. You know what I mean? So when it's clear, like you sort of see people being very deliberate about it, or being, doing too many cliches or being really hackneyed about it, but I have a great time every time I teach, and I know I've experienced, seeing really funny performers and people are teaching who have such a problem just getting through their class because they're just, they just kind of feel like people are beneath them or they're bored or they're too impatient, and so, to me, I think if you're teaching effectively, you're able to bring the comedy out of people, and you're able to, shape the class based on what they need, as opposed to, I'm a comedy genius, this is what I would do in a scene, so it's kind of hard, because it's like, how does Michael Jordan explain being Michael Jordan? It's like, I just do it, so when you have a comedy genius, like, I've taken classes with comedy geniuses, and sometimes those were the worst classes I ever took, because it's just like, it's just sort of like breathing air to them, and they're not able to communicate, like, or they don't take the perspective like, well, let me pretend like I don't know anything. And so how would I speak to somebody who doesn't have my refined knowledge and palate for comedy? How do I make it simple and clear, and how do I get them to be geniuses? So, it takes patience. And the other thing is, like, people have a lot of esteem wrapped up in teaching. And so when a class isn't going well, it's just like a show doesn't go well. And so you could get all downhearted about it. And so then you start getting impatient, or you start showing your sort of discontent with the class, and then they pick up on it. And then it's just a spiraling cycle where it's just like, they can tell that you don't like what they're doing, and now they don't like what they're doing, and now they're not feeling safe anymore, and they're not having fun, they're not being playful. And so what you do is just like, how do you go in there and just, so I can just go, hey, that was terrible. Oh my God. You know what? Let's try it again, but this time try that. You know what I mean? Like, I can be honest about it, but I don't, my self-esteem's not wrapped up in that. You know what I mean? That is kind of like, I'm just here to just kind of offer these things. People take what they can take, and they do what they do. And then hopefully it works or it doesn't work.
When you were talking about comedy geniuses, reminded me of something Keith Johnstone had said about Robin Williams, where he had said that I would hate to have Robin Williams in my class, just for those exact reasons as well, which I found really powerful, because Robin Williams is this singular comedian, but he would not work well in like an improv class, right?
I don't know. I think he might. It depends, like I think you got to meet Robin where Robin is, and I think you got to speak to him, well, when he was alive, the way he needs to hear it,
I took this digression. We were talking about your timeline, about you being in film school. So when you joined film school, you got pretty jaded by it, by the pretentious nature of it. And then around that time, you took a class with the actor Ivory Ocean, who introduced you to some improv exercises.
Okay.
And then around that same time, your friend Kevin Dove convinced you to go to some classes at Improv Olympic as well. And then you were hooked onto it completely. You were there in Chicago when the Mount Rushmore of improv performers were there, either at the IO or at Second City. And then later on, you were pretty critical in building the improv community in New York as well. You helped UCB set up a theater. You then founded The Pit, and then you founded Magnet. So I feel like you're one of the best people to answer this question. What are the differences between these two heavyweights, New York and Chicago, in terms of improv, comedy, and theater? Are there any defining traits between the two cities, if at all?
Well, I think less so. When I first came out here, definitely there was like a big difference. But because of the internet and because of people traveling all over the world, when we would first, in Chicago, we'd get invited out to go to different cities because they'd have like some kind of comedy festival and they were doing improv, and the kind of improv they were doing was just short form improv. And so they hadn't done long form. And so it was just very much like, whose line is it anyway? Just like quick press, And so you'd go out there one year and you just like start to teach them a little bit of long form. And then you'd go out there a couple years later, and then suddenly now there's like 2 long form improv theaters formed, And so the seeds started kind of just sprouting. And so that dissemination, that cultural diffusion is just like occurred over the decades.
And sorry, very quickly, what is the difference between short form improv and long form improv?
Okay, so short form is very structured. So there's games with set objectives. Okay. You know what I mean? So it's like, okay, you're going to do a scene where you're going to dub the dialogue for this scene from a movie. And so,
right.
And then we're just going to do specific styles. Like first we're going to do Westerns, And so, so it has like a lot of parameters, and there are just tricks that people learn that are going to be funny every time with the audience. So just like, and so it gets a little bit formulaic. So it's like, if you watch that show, Whose Line Is It Anyways, all those kinds of exercises, and people are really brilliant, someone like John Sessions, super hilarious, but what we were doing had to do with scenes and relationships and, Harold and longer scenes and things like that, things that were like more about, human nature, instead of like being gimmicky.
There's less gimmicks, but you're creating more of the stuff. There's less parameters. There's less games to it.
Yeah.
That's the long form. So I distracted you. You were talking about Chicago and New York.
Yeah. So when I first came out to New York, UCB was teaching classes and doing shows out of a theater called Soul Arts. And so they were only ones doing long form. And then there was like Chicago City Limits, where they would do comedy reviews, and they did improv, and a lot of it was like improv games, things like that. And so New York real estate, just terms of like stage time and space and rehearsal space and things like that was like very limited. Like in Chicago, rents were, less, and people usually had, decent sized apartments with a big living room, and so you could rehearse in that living room, and you didn't have to rent a studio and pay, like $50 an hour, same thing with stage. So UCB was renting per hour from this, so renting Thursdays and Saturdays and Sundays. So, so there was like a premium on time. And so the shows had to be in and out at a certain point, so there was like a little bit more discipline. And the other thing is the stages were smaller, so in that way, like it was a little bit more standing and talking heads kind of scenes that were going on, at UCB, because it's like, well, we only got 4 feet, and, so it was very verbal. Whereas in Chicago, stages are bigger, but then also they had accompanists. So you would have a piano player during the whole show, and they would underscore what you're doing. And, sometimes it would turn into a song. So it was just kind of like a little bit of a slower pace, and something had a little more breathing room to it. On the sort of bad end of the spectrum would be that things would get kind of sort of aimless and just go on forever. And, and people just kind of get lost in whatever sort of rabbit hole they went down. And so that would be the downside of it. But on the plus side, there would be like room for discovery or room for more physical work, whereas with UCB, it was all about, results, like you only had limited time. And so there was kind of a little bit more attack level of play in it. And so, New York being kind of being a very competitive town, highly educated people, people who are, well exposed to many different arts and things like that, like a bit harder to get a laugh, like where, in Chicago, it'd be like, oh yeah, like if you were just kind of whimsical, that'd be fine. But here you had to really, be smart and edgy, and so that had been like the kind of the nature of the style that was going on with UCB Improv. But then over time, because there was this kind of crossover and, and I spent a lot of time trying to work on physical work with people and discovery and, whereas like UCB is kind of like, well, we only got an hour here. We got to get them in, get them out. You know what I mean? So everything they were doing was under the clock and just trying to sort of be able to pay the rent. And so, I remember like I used to teach from 9 to 6 on Saturdays and Sundays. No lunch break, no break. Just like a chance for a quick bathroom break. You know what I mean? So, because it was just like they needed the money. So, so you're doing 9 hours, doing 18 hours in 2 days, straight class. Come in, they come out, boom, boom. And so, so I was like, okay, I adapted to it. And I was like really on board because I was like, I believed in the mission of like what we're trying to do and anything I do to contribute, to this being successful. But, again, it was just like kind of this like New York sort of driven, like, you can wait for someone to give up a seat on the subway or you could take the seat, And so that was kind of the thing. It was like, you got to go get it. So that was kind of the difference between the two places.
Can I tell you how much I love these type of insights that these little nuances of the city shapes so much of the theater, that the art form that comes out of it. You mentioned the size of the theater is smaller. So like the style of theater that you create is much different. The rental cost is it's more attack style of improv. You also mentioned in the previous interview that the weather in Chicago is much colder, so it beats down on people. So the kind of performers who show up have this innate sense of humility to them as compared to the people in New York.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also want to throw a third city into the mix, Los Angeles. Is there a difference in theater in Los Angeles?
Los Angeles, biggest industry town in the world for, entertainment, And so in Los Angeles, it's a driving city. So in terms of environment that, can't get anywhere unless you have a car most of the time. So you walk around, people are going to think you're some kind of drifter, murderer or something like that. Like there's something wrong with you if you're walking. But also it's impossible. You're going to like walk 8 miles to get someplace. And so it's hard to get audiences in New York, in Los Angeles, like that they would do a show and be like, oh, there's only 8 people here. And they'd be like, oh, that's great. We got an audience. Like, because nobody wants to have to drive, it's just such a pain in the butt. Like I remember visiting and trying to see my friends like, hey man, I'm here. Let's all, like, oh, who's going to drive and blah, blah. Like nobody wanted to like, so it wasn't like a big audience for theater. So that was like one thing. And the other thing is that like the shows were all kind of like auditions, like they were, it felt like many people treated them like there was like a showcase for them to get, seen by an agent or by a casting agent or something like that. And so sometimes you get the feel that like a few people would be showboating, be like that, that was kind of like, they're just, they're kind of playing for them, And so that was never like, the shows, I felt, sometimes when people played that way, it was to the detriment of it, I haven't been out there in a long time, so I haven't seen a show. I'm not saying all shows are like that, but there's a little bit of vibe sometimes like that.
It's so interesting, right? It's a driving city, so that changes the kind of audience that would show up. And because of the influence of Hollywood, you would have a lot of people who are trying to put a bit more out there, project a lot more, which maybe this is a silly question, maybe it's too abstract, but is it possible for theaters to have a personality to themselves? So like if you're looking at IO or Second City or the Groundlings, is it possible that there are some defining traits of the theater themselves?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, whoever runs a theater, their preferences is going to, is going to affect like who succeeds at that place, that you're going to end up, sort of rewarding things that you like and, and sort of excluding things you don't like, so it's kind of impossible to not have that bias. But I think it's important to kind of struggle against that, and so like, I feel like that, sometimes you can notice what a certain director or a certain person running a program values, what kind of comedy they like, and, over the years, people have noticed that, especially in terms of exclusion, in terms of like gender or people of color, things like that, because it's just like, well, it's a bunch of white dudes up there, like, and they're just doing their kind of humor, and so, or just like the notion of like MTV wasn't playing rap videos, because they seem to have a preference for, a certain type of videos, and especially like British artists and things like that. And then, finally they played Michael Jackson's Thriller, and it was like, wow, oh, there's a ton of money having people of color, and then next thing you know, it's like, oh, great. Now, if you look at this now, it's a bit more representative of the world because, you don't have somebody being the gatekeeper based on their own biases.
So important who's the founder and what values they believe in. You are the founder of the Magnet Theater, so let's dive into some of your values. You're one of the best improv teachers out there, so it would be a federal crime, at the least, if I didn't ask you for some tips on how to improvise and just pick your brains on the art of improvisation. There's a preconceived notion about improv that you always have to be doing something, that you always have to be driving the scene, that you have to be talking all the time, filling in the silence. And you have often taught your students to really embrace the silence and to take it slow, which feels counterintuitive at times and easier said than done, because when you're on stage and the spotlight's on you, you feel this need to like fill in those gaps with something to say. So I just want to expand on this a bit further. What is the importance of silence in a scene? And then what are the benefits of taking it slow in an improv scene?
Yeah. Okay. So to begin with, like, if you're in the process of like improvising and creating on the spot, to be kind of grounded and centered is going to be, to kind of come from a place of being relaxed and effortless. You're going to get your best work, And so because people come in there with all the fears and insecurities that they would have, which are natural, like you're going to get up on stage and you're going to be nervous because, you want to be funny. You don't want to look embarrassed, do anything that's not going to get a laugh. And so you're all like jacked up and things like that. And so sometimes that's what makes people succeed, like that kind of energy is what really brings out the comedy in them. But for other people, it's something that gets in the way, and so just kind of getting people to settle down, like, okay, you know what, like you don't have to be funny, it's all right to be funny. We want you to be funny, but like first, just kind of like just be okay, just being there and being grounded, and do things based on inspiration as opposed to on trying to please the theater or trying to please the teacher or trying to please the audience, Mick Napier taught one of the worst classes I ever had, but one that I lost. He taught one of the best worst classes, like because I learned the most from it. But like he came into the class and he started the class by pulling out like a big thick wad of $1 bills. So he had a whole bunch of $1 bills, and he's like, "Hey, everybody, here's your chance to earn some money today." And he said, like, so at the end of every scene, the audience is going to vote on who wins the dollar. And so that's your objective is like, okay, you got to win that dollar. And we'd been having some really fun classes with Mick, but then suddenly, oh my goodness, the scene just became horrible. Yeah. People got into a panic because it was like you wanted to win that dollar, and so instead of just trying to be honest and organic in your improv and come from a place of inspiration, people were starting to do hacky stuff, and it was only the students that kind of retained their composure. They're the ones that always scored. They're the ones that always did great scenes despite this weird little distraction of like, for $1, you're going to sell your partner out. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so at the end of the class, Mick just kind of said, okay, so what's more important, process or product? And it's like, boom, oh my goodness. Like that was just amazing. So that was just sort of like, this is one of the things I really got out of Mick. Like I thought Mick was just an amazing teacher. Yeah. And so you got to put that aside. You got to put people's fears aside. You got to kind of just welcome to be like, just relax. Like when you have your biggest belly laughs is when you're hanging out with your friends, joking around. You know what I mean? There's no goal there, but to just kind of have fun and socialize. So that's just kind of the mode I try and get people in. Now, when it comes to scene work and silence, silence is a chance to have epiphanies. That you're speaking in a scene and there's a situation going on, and then you stop speaking for a little bit, and then you begin to internalize the moment. You start to take in, and and so at that point, people have realizations and they make discoveries by having silence. And also, it's kind of a way in which every scene's got its own kind of tension. And silence is a great way to kind of find that tension. Like, you ever been in a situation where like you're not talking to your roommate every time you see them? It's like, you're not saying anything, but like you're getting affected, And so it's one way to make discoveries in the scene, and to have kind of a deeperness, that you're going deeper because you're not exploring things on a superficial level. Dell used to call that the third thought, that in a scene, you're responding to somebody's initiation and you could kind of say the first thing that comes to mind. And that might not be the most inspired because it's like superficial, but then you got the second thought and then finally the third thought when you really internalize it. So for some people, it could be a way in which it really works. For other people, their first thought's the best thought. Their third thought's way over processed, over analyzed, So one thing I know about improv is it's not one size fits all, one style fits all. That slow and patient is going to be very fruitful for some people. Fast and attack is going to be great for other people. And so you have to have a realization of like what works best for you, and it's all valid if it works.
I like that idea from Dell about the third thought. It was definitely helpful for you because when you were first going to come up with the Armando Diaz show, the first rehearsal was a disaster. And then the second rehearsal, the only piece of advice Dell gave you was when you receive the prompt from the audience, just look away and like act like you're getting into character and look back, even though you were going to be the exact same person. Yeah. And just taking that moment changed the entire rehearsal, and then the show kicked off from there. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so again, it's not dogma. Because I think sometimes like teachers, like you really want to flex your intellectual prowess, like talk about, I have the keys to comedy and you have brains of mush and I'm going to shape you into the, to look like me, It's ridiculous.
Let me ask you then, you brought up the dogma. You also brought up a lot of the epiphanies of it and how it was being received by the audience. There's so many interesting concepts. So it brings up an overarching question about the philosophy of improv. Keith Johnstone had said, people think it is like show business, but it is more like sport. In Truth and Comedy, Del Close and Shana Halpin had spoken about the interplay in improv between art and sport. And they had spoken about the influence of the actual Olympics when they were coming up with the IO and the interplay in art and sport between that. How do you view improv? Is it an art form? Is it entertainment? Is it sports and games? Or is it something even deeper than that, something else?
I mean, it could be its own thing. You know what I mean? Like we live in a world where we have to categorize things and, not trying to be like one of these snooty artists. This is like, that's kind of, we don't have labels for our music, but I do agree that there's a sports-like part of it, because it is about being an optimal situation, that like you're sharp, you're ready, like you're in the moment, like you're firing on all cylinders, and so that just like with sports, you do warm-ups and things to kind of get your mind ready to do this thing, and I would imagine like in other creative activities, it's kind of like, well, you're going to sit down to write. And so you got to like, let me be in my quiet place and have my coffee and like, not have any again, it's still a sport, you know what I mean? That like, it's a solitary sport, but just in terms of like human performance, I guess would be the thing, like if you're going to analyze it that way. Now, because of the fact that you have multiple people doing it, the sports metaphor can kind of map over that pretty well because you're trying to get people to work well together. So it's like if you're coaching a basketball team, well, you need for people to, run the offense and kind of pay attention to where people are and pass the ball when you need to pass the ball and things like that. And so there's sports-like qualities like where we got to, when you really have a team in the right mindset, and they're going to do a rocking show because, you make sure everybody's present and everybody's like, approaching the work the way they need to, so in a sense, the sports part of it's like a preparation. And, just like basketball is an improvisational sport because you have plays, but those plays are just there to create moments of opportunity. That's kind of like, oh, if I set a pick and then, you come around and then I get into the basket, I'm going to be open, then it's up to me to do whatever I'm going to do. So when we teach it, there can be structures or sort of conventions or tropes that kind of set you up for moments, but it's still, you're filling in the blanks, but then I guess on the highest level, you don't see the sports part of it because it's like you having experience, you need that less and less. You don't need to, you're able to kind of get yourself in a mode where you're going to do that without having to do all the like breathless, like warm-ups and things like that, or having to remind yourself, give affirmations, you're just like, okay, well, I do what I do. And so, my mind's trained to when I show up at the show, I'm going to be sharp and ready and I don't need to do any of that stuff, So it varies. So I think like anything, there's a kind of a mixture of contributing, influences and structures and things like that.
Del had said something very interesting in an interview where he had said that if you position your show as sports and games, then the audience is a lot more lenient to you. But if you position it as an art form, then they're a bit more critical because they come trying to judge art, which I found very interesting. I'm going to bombard you with Del Close quotes today because I have another one.
Sure.
He had once said that the kind of improv that I'm particularly addicted to is the kind that aims at creating a momentary fragmentary experience that has a totality to it. It's kind of like fireworks. It's the more ephemeral of art forms. Once it's gone, baby. And I quite resonate with this quote because every time I've watched good improv and the few times that I performed, I have this sense of regret. When I've performed, it's always been about, oh, this is what I could have done with the scene. This is what I should have said. This is the way I should have played the character, knowing fully well that I'll never get the opportunity to play that character again or do that scene again. And when I've watched good improv, I always have this sense of regret that I want to see that story develop further. Like I want to see those characters again. And improv by definition, it will never happen again. I'll never see those characters again. It's not been recorded. So I only have to commit it to memory, which will also fade over time. So I have that sense of regret. I guess I'm supposed to live with this curse because that is literally the definition of improv. Have you ever felt the same way?
Oh yeah, all the time, And but you get to have those moments. You know what I mean? Like if it were only just regret, like every time you do a show, it's like, oh God, everything went wrong. Everything was terrible again. but now after the show, I got all these brilliant ideas, but it's the moments that you do succeed and do get to those magical moments where it's like, I totally knew you were going to do that. Like it's really funny whenever I see people perform or, in a class and suddenly two people just mutually decide to do the same thing, just because it just occurred to them and they were in sync and, so it's just those kind of moments, like to me, the best shows feel like they only last a minute long, and it's kind of like you got a little bit of it's like a little bit of a haze, like, the audience is there, but you kind of feel like you're in this weird zone and, and so you get the privilege of doing that, it's like why play golf? Golf is sorry, I was swearing, but it's a shitty game.
Why trying to alienate my audience?
I know. Golf is a terrible game. It's all about failure. It's all about, the course being against you, trying to thwart you in every moment. That you're doing this impossible thing. But the minute your club makes good contact with the ball and you hear that whack, and just through your arms going up into your shoulders, into your spine, you hit it solid and like it's going and it kind of takes off like a rocket, like a F-35, taking off from a aircraft carrier, like that suddenly obliterates all the ills of the sport, like that putt that you got in, so, it's just the nature of life. Like, you fall in love. Well, you're not going to stay in love like in the same way that you once were, we live in a universe which is all built on creative explosions, like whatever force that may have created this place or not, just decided, it's just like, that's how it gets done. Things explode, things reorganize, then they explode again. It's just how it is. So you have to kind of appreciate the beauty and, love the game and love the player and don't hate on it,
How do you teach improv if everything is made up and the points don't matter? Then do you have any golden rules, any 10 commandments that you use that you teach your students?
It's a matter of kind of understanding what you need to do when. And so like when it comes to the beginning, you have to kind of understand what are the first things people have to learn to start to improvise together. And so much of it's just kind of like putting things in order, in the lesson. So it's like, you're not going to do a herald on day one, You're trying to get people to yes and you're just trying to get people to play. That's the first thing. It's like, let's just be playful. Let's just be in the room together. Let's have some laughs so people relax. And then, the exercises are built to teach the lesson. So I don't end up giving a lot of notes when I teach early level classes because really, it's just in the activity. You have to just do it. And then the reward is getting laughs and succeeding. So that kind of reinforces the lesson. So you get classical conditioning there, you get, so you start to learn, it's like, oh yeah, when I yes and people, I get laughs. Like it sneakily starts to kind of condition you. Like in a way you're socializing people to this community. Like here in this village, this is what we do. We support each other. We listen. We yes and we're not afraid to share. So you're doing like some very basic things that don't have any like easily identifiable objectives on the surface, and so the way you measure success is kind of different when you're teaching a beginning class, whereas like later on, you're trying to achieve much more specific kind of goals. And so the exercises are kind of just scaled up to reflect what you're trying to do on each level, and so in the beginning, it's just like, let's just play. When it gets to things like doing long forms, in order to do long form structures, it helps to do good, solid scene work, because the scene work is the bricks. Those are the building blocks. And so if those are shaky, the whole structure kind of falls. So you end up doing a lot of scene work in the middle levels, it isn't just learn how to start a scene. It's about like really learn how to have a point of view and how to sustain that point of view. And, start to play games, which really has to do with like holding on to your character's intentions. And then just teaching ideas of ensemble, that how do you be your best in the group, but then also collaborate with people, that when to step out, be in the scene, and when to hang back, when to just do some support work, and when to, and so you start teaching the idea of ensemble and getting the group to do games where you kind of learn how to pick up each other's moves and do things that are not pre-planned, and you start slowly giving people insights into, improv lessons, things that they could have done better. You start giving them notes. So, so in many ways, it's like learning a language that it's like, first you just start speaking, it's just like ball, cup, this, and then it's kind of more about the rituals of things. It's just like, can I go outside, or where's the restaurant, and then gets more sophisticated, start learning about syntax and increase the vocabulary and, sense structure, what I mean? So, but you can't, the mistake early teachers make is that they put these advanced lessons too early, or they're afraid to kind of go back to basics, in a higher level class where you just kind of need people like, okay, we're getting a little bit, disconcerted, or we're not like, let's just go back to simple things,
Very interesting the way you segmented it, and like how the entry level classes, the exercise itself is the lesson, like just the conditioning itself is very important. And then when you move on to like the future levels, at that point you can start giving notes and start focusing more on scene work as well. I find it very, very interesting, a very great way to segment it. We spoke about the performers. Let's talk about the audience. Vilo Spolin had once said that the audience is the most revered member of the theater. Without an audience, there is no theater. Everything done is ultimately for the enjoyment of the audience. They are our guests, fellow players, and the last spoke in the wheel, which can then begin to roll. They make the performance meaningful. So let's talk about the audience. What role does an audience play? Is it important? Is it mandatory to have someone out there to receive this art that you're creating? If I were to frame the question a different way, would improv mean the same to you if you were just performing in your living room with your friends and no one was there to ever see it?
Well, to an improviser, it's fun to just get laughs anywhere, and that's why people just end up doing bits all the time wherever they're at. Like, we're hanging out, we're socializing, we're just making jokes, trying to make each other laugh. But you do want there to be an audience, because then it feels like it matters. Like it's kind of like gambling. We could like play poker and not play for any money. And that can be fun, but then it gets more exciting when there is money and there's, danger. So the audience provides the success and the danger. It's kind of like getting on a roller coaster, or going to a haunted house or whatnot. They kind of put the stakes in. The audience is what makes it real, and so, it resonates through them, so that's the feedback. That's kind of the reward, so yeah, they're hugely important. You couldn't do this without. And so I'm a big believer in having audiences as a way of composing, that, when it comes to like comedy, it's great to, you're doing sketch comedy and you trying scenes out in front of an audience is great because then you get to see what works and then you can like rewrite it and do it again. And then you can really polish things. With music, like that. There are bands that, they rely on the audience to kind of really help shape their songs and things like that. Yeah. Or theater, that people are writing new plays. And so you try it out and you workshop it. And so one of the things in the modern world now is that there's such a factory assembly line of things that it's all about content. And you don't get to try things out. It's just like you're going to make music on your computer, in your house and then it gets on Spotify and And so that could be perfectly brilliant stuff. But I do think the audience keeps you honest. And that's one of the things, in terms of like film school, what I didn't like was that you didn't have an audience. You had other filmmakers in the class. And so there was just sort of a lot of pretense there, that there was not an honest discussion, because it's like, well, you don't want to criticize your fellow classmates' stuff, because then they're going to criticize your stuff, and it's going to, so there's like a lot of pretentious sort of non-communicative response, so the audience to me is huge. And I kind of wish that they could be used more, instead of that, with the internet and cable TV and all these kind of content platforms, that people crank stuff out without it being totally ready.
So interesting, right? The audience is that essential feedback loop that you need to be able to refine it and know what connects and what doesn't connect. I find it fascinating. So I spoke earlier about, you had brought up Mick Napier's best worst class. You had also mentioned some things that teachers do wrong. You have been an instrumental member in creating the improv community in New York City. You first helped set up UCB, then you founded The Pit, and then you founded Magnet. What shortcomings did you notice in existing theaters that inspired you to start your own theater? What were they missing at that point that you wanted to incorporate?
It was culture, as well as like teaching style. That if you haven't got a feel for me yet, that I kind of appreciate a little bit more of an organic style of improv.
Yeah.
And that I feel that you can have that and you can play on a high level, that just because you embrace that doesn't mean you can't turn out work that is worthy of like bigger audiences, or being at your top of your game, but also just in terms of an organization, it's like, I didn't like, being around dysfunctional workplaces. And so to me, it was so crazy that like, when we found improv, it was just pure and honest, and there was kind of no bullshit, because either something was funny or wasn't. Nobody fake laughs, But then when it came to organizations, then there was kind of just all kinds of weird dysfunction where it didn't feel like people were being honest. It didn't feel like you were sort of fostering a safe environment. Like, it was, it wasn't like the best idea won. There were cliques and, if you were friends with a certain person, then, you'd get your show, or, you'd get like, it became political and it became like high school. And it was just like, geez, did we go through all this to just go back to high school? So I never wanted for the theater I have for me to walk in and get the terrible, horrible feeling of like, oh my God, there's a person here I don't want to see, and like get all stiff and uncomfortable. Like, I like walking in the theater and I can talk to anybody, whether it's a performer or it's a staff member and it's an audience member, and not have to worry, not to have to feel like there's, somebody got to make an impression on, or somebody that hates you or you hate them, or like, there's no animosity. So for me, it just kind of seemed like, well, there's no purpose in that. Like, if we could just embrace the ideas of improv, that can make for a better organization. So that's really at the heart of like why I wanted to start my own theater.
If I have to think about like some of my favorite memories in New York City, it's just this summer that I had when I used to just walk down the High Line and go to the Magnet Theater for a class. I used to look forward to it so much and have so much fun over there. Met so many interesting people, had a great instructor. It's just such a core memory. I want to step in your shoes for a minute. It's not easy running a theater. So what are some of the challenges of running a theater in New York City?
Well, part of it was like working on myself, because it's sort of like becoming a father or mother, suddenly like you got this, you got a family you got to take care of. And so whatever shortcomings you have are going to either get in the way of it or you're going to overcome them. So I learned a lot, because there were things that I just didn't know how to do. There were things that I were totally afraid of, all kinds of words and security.
Like what?
Things like, I'd never been to business school. And so I've been kind of more of a creative person. And so when it came to something like bookkeeping, suddenly I was in a position where it's like, that was the thing I was afraid of. And I was like, suddenly I had to do all the bookkeeping, you know what I mean? And so, through trial and error, I would just be, working 18-hour days, just trying to get the books reconciled and like learn about that stuff and not really have any mentors and things like that. And then finances, finances is scary, like money's scary. Cause geez, what if we go under, we owe money or we're not able to bring in money. Like, there's so much fear involved with that, but then once you start experiencing it, it's like, okay, something happens and you lose money, or like there's a fee that you got to pay. Suddenly, oh, there's a tax. Like, they just passed a new real estate tax, blah, 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 so that first thing is just like kind of, you yourself running the place have to be healthy and do things in a constructive and productive way, But when it comes to that, like you also need people to do the same thing, Now they can't do that stuff if you don't know how to do that. And so I think early on I was learning how to do that. And, at first you're just happy to get any help. So anybody's like, hey, you know what? We need to install like a lighting system, blah, blah, blah. Sure, I'll do it. And then this person doesn't know a thing about what they're doing. And then it's like, we just paid $2,000 to this person and they did like crappy job, so at first you kind of like, you think it's people, it's just like, oh, I don't know, that person's likable. Yeah, great. Do the job. You got to learn how to hire people. In order to do that, you got to know how to do the jobs. You got to know what's required of them, how to communicate the objectives, it's just like teaching improv, that it's all the same thing is that, if people don't know what their roles are, they know what their expectations are, what the parameters are. You don't encourage them, you don't reward them, you don't correct them when they need to. Yeah. And then there's times where you have to be protective, like your mother goose, you're fighting off the predators to protect the little baby chicklings, that you have to protect the space. So sometimes there's toxic people that enter in, like that. Some student comes in and there's, they got some kind of hostile vibe to them and they're like making people feel uncomfortable. And they're like, okay, well, you have to talk to that person, you have to kind of find out what the deal is. And it's like, so you're the, as much as it could feel like, oh, this is like really fun space and like, it's just all love and hugs and kisses. You have to also defend your kingdom, like you have to protect your kids, and so you learn how to do that. And hopefully, if you're constantly reinforcing these things, you don't have to do it too often. But in the beginning, if you're not able to kind of make it clear as to like what's acceptable in this environment and what's not, people, you start getting those situations where it's like, okay, there's a toxic person and now there's a lot of people that are been harmed by this person now. And this person's really deeply embedded and that becomes really hard to kind of like extricate them. And, you don't want to hurt their feelings. You don't want to destroy them as a person. And, but there's all these other people that are harmed and you got to like help them heal. And it's kind of like, but if you get to the point where you can prevent it, you get rid of all that sorrow. So in the beginning, there are lots of times where there are crises and kind of like without the experience, there are times where it's like, oh, if I would have known better, this probably would have happened, but there's always surprises like that.
I'm sure this is only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to all the challenges of running a theater. Running a theater in general is so tough. Running it in New York City is probably even harder. I'm just happy you are there as the mother goose for the improv community, and creating the space for everyone who's interested in improv is such a nice place to be. I highly encourage people to go there. We could talk for hours, Armando, but I have to start wrapping up. Before we move to closing questions, I would love it if you can tell me what masterpiece you built with the Lego and what do you think I've built with the Lego.
Oh, I'm not sure what I built, but let me... this is my new sort of boutique hotel called the Veranda. That's what I'm going to call it. So it's like one of those like designer-ish kind of hotels where irregular shaped rooms with strange amenities.
What's the strange amenities? What's the theme?
There's a squash court and then there's a full working spa, but then there's also there's to get to your rooms you have to go up a climbing wall. So just on one wing of the hotel, so it's for the adventurous people. You have to, there's no way to get in. Like even if it's late at night, you have to climb the wall. Yeah. And the other part is kind of for the more like laid back people. So
that's how it is at the Veranda. You have to be able to climb to your room. I completely on board with the idea.
Yeah.
What about my masterpiece?
This is a carbon capture factory. So you guys are extracting carbon and sequestering it into the ground to try and save the earth.
Wow. Yeah. Look, I always had noble intentions. I just didn't know it. So we've got the Veranda, we've got the carbon capture factory. What more do you need is what I would say. Let's move into some of our closing questions. What are some books, movies, role models that have strongly inspired you?
This is always one of those questions that, I kind of have more of an unusual answer because, I love learning stuff. So it's not like I consume comedy books, like instruction manuals in comedy. It's like for me, it's I think I get fed so much by learning about other areas, and sort of other art forms and stuff like that. So being able to kind of see the parallels in terms of like somebody other person's like, creative, creative method or something like that. Like, the Beatles, like obviously so many people talk about the influence of the Beatles and like how great they are. And to me, like in watching documentaries and knowing their work and stuff like that, seeing interviews, they're improvisers. They're totally, they're totally tapped in. And so one of the things that I always kind of found amazing about them was like, they would just write whatever songs they wanted to, like something like a White Album. They got all these things that have nothing to do with rock and roll, like just all kinds of different forms of songs and styles and things like that. And they're like, yeah, we're just going to do it. Like they just have total belief in themselves. Yeah. And the group dynamics was that way too, because like the four of them seemed to be okay with that. They was like, okay, we're going to write, some song about turning 64. It's like, that's not rock and roll. Like the other three members are yes-anding each other, what I mean? So to me, I think that probably is the only way they could have put out such a body of work is that whole thing of just like, we're going to just try and be all turned on and tuned in and supportive of each other and constantly taking in, learning, expanding their music, learning new styles, being influenced by all kinds of art and things going on. And so like, to me, like, I think that's like a great inspiration in terms of being creative and artistic. And for me, like a lot of lessons were very much in terms of classes or in terms of shows or certain performers and things like that. So it's hard for me to kind of like name a book that's like, go out and read that, if people have got tips, like follow them, what I mean? But, and so for me early on, like I had trouble reading, what I mean? So, I had never read a book until like I was in high school. So it's not kind of like my go-to way of learning. I tend to like lectures. I could always absorb things through lectures and remember them, and so I think that kind of makes sense in terms of me being a teacher, being able to listen. And so just, I don't know, like any kind of good book, it was great. I mean? Like just, so I think just because I think there's one thing, where you can just study what you do, what I mean? So it's kind of like you're into pottery. So all I'm going to do is ever absorb lessons about pottery. but you need to learn other things. You get inspiration from other areas, and you start thinking about pottery in a different way because you learned how to, I don't know, like to bake or something like that. So to me, it's like so much of what gives me inspiration has to do with like outside stuff. And then also just like, I tend not to watch so many comedies, you know what I mean? Like if something's really exceptional, I'll watch it. But like a lot of stuff, like I'm kind of like, where to me, like some of the best comedy movies are not comedy movies. Like something like Apocalypse Now, I think is an amazing comedy movie. You know what I mean? Because the performances, like the characters are so burlesque, so over the top,
Yeah.
Where it's just like, Frederick Forrest plays the chef character and they're in the boat and he wants to go out and like go find some mangoes, and they go out there and they think they hear something in the bushes and suddenly a tiger springs out and then he snaps, and he gets on the boat. It's like, fuck this shit. Fuck this shit. Hi, tiger. Starts getting naked. And you're like, oh my God, what a committed, amazing performance. But it's so human and hilarious, so over the top. It's like he's really committed, and it fits that story and scene. But like as a performer, like I'm just like, oh my God, that is so hilarious, or like you look at Kurt's character, and he's like such a funny caricature, it's like, you either fight or you surf, yeah, I mean? So I don't know. So I guess it's one of those things where it's like having an overdeveloped, palate. So it's kind of like, I get snobby about comedy. So to me, it's just like, it's the other places to find stuff, So that's why it's always a dissatisfying answer for me to like, what were things that inspired you? But obviously we talked about SNL and then all those movies that came out, like Stripes and Monty Python and Animal House and Faulty Towers and a lot of great stuff. The Brass Eye, ridiculous things. The Young Ones, like I tend to get influenced quite a lot by British comedies, intelligent stuff. So I don't know. This is kind of a meandering answer to that. I don't know if that's.
I think it's a great list. I find a very satisfactory list. And it's interesting you brought the Beatles, because when you were talking about the audience, the first thing that came to my mind was about how the Beatles used to actually play in all these clubs in Germany. I think I forget where it was. And when they were improvising these songs, they would just see the crowd's reaction and then try to work on the song again. So there's so much improvisation in music as well. I'm going to ask you some unfair questions. Who is the greatest improviser of all time and why?
It's just kind of hard to say because it's like at any one moment somebody is the greatest one. I've seen a lot of people that are great, and I haven't seen that many. You know what I mean? Like I've seen people in my small, tiny experience of the world. And there's just people who are like, Tina Fey was always great to watch because so smart, and so like, yeah, I mean that her, the idea she would express the comedy that she would like bring on stage, or Kevin Dorff was always a great improviser, or Amy Poehler, great character player. There are people that could just totally humanize things. Like Mike Myers was always, fun to watch. He always just had a lot of joy and just, it's just multifaceted. There was like nothing he couldn't do. So I don't know. It's kind of like saying, like, it's kind of an unfair question, but people ask it. Like we talk about the NBA, and it's kind of like, all right, who's the GOAT? And it's like, well, a certain period of time, this person was the GOAT. And then if you could, time travel and put them in a cage and have, LeBron play Michael Jordan versus Kobe Bryant versus, Wilt Chamberlain versus, Bill Russell versus Bob Cousy, like you don't know, but yeah, I don't think I don't require an answer to that question.
It is an unfair question, but if you have to create a Mount Rushmore of improv performers, all the names you took, Tina Fey, Amy Poehler, Kevin Dorff, Mike Myers, all of them, I think, belong on that Rushmore. Second unfair question for you. Greatest comedian of all time, and why?
Again, same answer. There's just a lot of them, I always enjoyed Richard Pryor, I loved Jerry Seinfeld and Dave Chappelle or Paula Poundstone or there's probably names Maria Bamford cracks me up, and she talks a lot about mental health, and not everyone's cup of tea, but she's just so damn honest about it, and she's so much heart to what she does, I remember seeing a set by Robin Williams. I was like, oh my God, he actually did a disciplined set, like that. I was like, I think it was in his cocaine days, but poor guy. But there's just kind of a lot of people that Mitch Hedberg, I'm missing a lot. Like one person I like a lot is Tom Papa or Jim Gaffigan. He's great. There's just millions of them. I've enjoyed a bit of Nimesh Patel. He's pretty funny. This is one of the things where it's like if I went home suddenly I'd probably think about 20 more comedians that were, so.
Yeah, that's a great list already. Last two questions. What would you like your legacy to be? And I know this is a slightly silly question for someone who has an entire improv format named after him, but how would you like to be remembered apart from the Armando?
I have a clean driving record and, had a good credit rating. It is, one always wants to be appreciated for your work, and amongst your peers, so that's always a thing, and so I feel very fortunate, like I wanted to do this theater, and it's taken many years to get it off the ground and get it to the place where it is. So I kind of feel like, if Magnet alone were the thing I was known for, that would be enough for me. Like that's awesome. But I guess it's just like every time I get into a class, I teach it and then it goes well. It's like, great. I'm also very content with being known as a good improv teacher, Yeah.
That's a great legacy that you leave behind. And when I was looking for improv classes, well, your name was always on the top and Magnet Theater was up there as well. So it's a great legacy. Final question. What is the meaning of life, Armando Diaz? What is the meaning of all of this?
It's for each person to kind of find their meaning, I think that's what it's all about. But when improvising, it's constantly the challenge of sort of finding the scene, it's like that mountain you climb up every time, and so life, John Cleese talked about the idea of thinking about yourself as a guided missile. And so a guided missile has a guidance system, and so it starts heading towards a target. And then every time it goes, kind of veers off course, it corrects itself and kind of brings it on. And so I think throughout life, the meaning is discovering what that target is and kind of fighting the obstacles of what throws you off the target and gets you back on, And so, the meaning I think is probably different for everybody. But I think the sooner you kind of know that it's something that starts from inside you first. And that's an answer you have to give yourself, as much as you can be guided by and helped by other like institutions and structures and philosophies and religions and teachers and things like that. It's got to start from who you are out. And and I guess the benefit of life is it is this video game where you kind of walk and then the next room appears, and like you get, so, if you knew it all at first, what would you do the rest of your life, So it's kind of like until the end, you're still trying to stay on course,
Life is like a guided missile. It's the first time I've heard it, but I like it.
John Cleese.
Got to pay the credit. Armando, if people want to find you, if they want to connect with you, they want to find out more about improv, take a class with you, what is the best way to find you?
Magnettheater.com.
Magnet Theater is the place to be. I highly recommend it. Armando, thank you so much. It was an honor and a privilege.
Well, thank you. I appreciate this and enjoyed the conversation.